Here we go, and screen back to Kent. So I will start out with the mess. I keep forgetting that guy. I'm going to start out with this message from Kent. Kent Dodds, if you're not familiar, great host, former software dev at PayPal, then Remix. He's done a lot of stuff with Remix, but he's promoting the Remix Conf this year. He's got 25% off discounts for the tickets, which are like $600. So 25% off is a really good deal. I will put this information in Discord, so don't worry about trying to Photoshop it. I will get it to you. 25% off coupon. They also have discounts at the hotel that they host at, the Sheraton, which is an awesome place. So let me know. I'm trying to go myself if I can convince my wife. Otherwise, I don't get to go this year. Anywho, I will kick that back off. Anyway, this is Rex Denver. Thank you for coming. Hello, everyone. This is like 7 years going so far. I think it's fun. I think. This is not what I do. I am a software engineer. I don't, my meetings are usually like 5 people, and that's already too much. Zoom already is more than enough that I can handle. So if Charlie wants, do you want to come over and say hi?
Everybody, my name's Charlie. Over to the trade desk. I work here. Thank you all for coming through. And the only spiel I have is that the bathrooms, you go out that way, you cross the main entry, and then they're on your left side here. Next big stack. If you need anything, we got pizza, we got drinks, good stuff. Cups for water. Otherwise, holler at me.
Cool. All right. So now you don't have to listen to me anymore. We have Eli here. Talk about Cypress component testing. Cypress is awesome. Will gave us a great talk about it 3 years ago, 4 years ago. I don't remember, but Cypress awesome testing, end-to-end testing library. I will turn it over to Eli. Thanks.
I can hear you.
You do not need to applaud me, please.
Let me get set up here real quick. When need to enable screen share?
Yes. Screen share. Right now.
Set up with all the font sizes and stuff. And as everything, when you start sharing Zoom, it comes to a switching point. Is that code legible?
Yeah.
Nothing like getting down a piece of pizza right before you get up and start. Made sure I didn't grab soda though, so I'm not up here belching. All that stuff we're talking. Well, hey, everybody, thank you for coming, especially for those who decided to, come from home and come visit me in person. This is my first time back at a meetup since all the chaos started, and it's awesome seeing everybody and excited to be here. But today I'm here to talk to you about React component testing with Cypress. My name is Eli Lucas. I am the head of developer ecosystem at Cypress, which means I get to come out and talk to fun folks like yourself about testing and software development and all that fun stuff. On my day-to-day work, I do things like create educational content, update the documentation, talk to developers, build sample apps, all that kind of fun stuff. So if you have any questions about Cypress or React or anything like that, come let me know. I love having conversations. You can find me on pretty much all the socials at Eli Lucas. And a little bit about Cypress. Okay, first I want to, like, you don't know what Cypress is, hold your hands up. Okay, well, we got one joker at least. Okay, so Cypress is a application that you can use to test your websites. We've been around for quite a while, probably about 6 to 7 years or whatnot. And we became really popular, especially in the front end testing space. We recently just passed about 5 million downloads on NPM a week, and pretty ubiquitous. So that's why I'd like to start with, like, hey, who hasn't heard of Cypress versus, like, who's heard of Cypress? Just to give me a little bit of a feel for the room and whatnot. But like I said, Cypress is an application that you can use to test your front end web applications. It's free, it's open source. You can feel free to get started on it. It's pretty easy to get up and running on your application. If you have any questions about that, I'm going to show it a little bit. If you have any questions about that, you can come let me know. Also want to give a little bit of plug to Cypress Cloud. And Cypress Cloud is our SaaS portion of the business. So this is an optional service that you can use. What Cypress Cloud does is it records all of your previous test recordings and gives you analytics into, like, stuff like how long it took your test suites to run, how, like, which tests are passing, full history on that kind of stuff. If you have, like, any flakiness in your test suites, you can also go and view, like, past recordings. And so if a test failed, you can actually see a video of, like, what was going on when your test failed. You can look at the previous logs and whatnot. And it can also help you save time in your CI by helping, like, orchestrate different CI servers and whatnot to run in parallel to test your suite. So it can save you time and save you money in that. I do want to say, though, that it's completely optional. Sometimes people think that in order to use Cypress, you have to pay for it. That's not true. The Cypress app is open source and it is free. So tonight, though, I'm here to talk to you about component testing. So people usually think of Cypress for end-to-end testing. The difference between end-to-end testing and component testing is with end-to-end testing, you're visiting a website. And so you're saying, like, hey, visit this particular URL. And then you use Cypress commands to do things on the website, like navigate through links or type in text boxes, click buttons and whatnot. And then once you do these actions, you do assertions to make sure that the state of your application is what you expect it to be. And that's end-to-end testing. Component testing is you're mounting a particular component in isolation. And so think if you had something as small as a button, you could do that, mount it in isolation, and only write tests particular for that button. Now, when we're using a component-based framework like React, usually we compose components into larger components. And so think like you now have a list of, like, buttons and widgets and all these other things to make up bigger components. And so you can test those bigger components in isolation as well. The advantage of doing something like that is component tests are generally faster to run. They require less setup, and they're easier to write. You don't usually have to worry about setting up any type of backend server, databases, whatnot, to do all that kind of stuff. And so we see a lot of people that have big end-to-end suites start to take some of the things that they were doing to test, like, particular edge cases on their components and whatnot, converting those to component tests and shaving massive time off their test suites. All right, that's about all I have for a spiel on all this fun stuff. So demo time. I figured that we would kind of do a little role playing here in between. We're a developer, and we just got handed some designs from our design department on a particular form to build. And so it's going to be a login form. This is what it looks like. We got a few different states that the form could be in. So we could have, like, invalid form fields, like you forgot to put in your username and password. And then if the form is valid, we get a nice welcome message. to see. So we're going to build this form together. It's going to be a big pair programming session. All right, so to get started, I've already done these steps, so you don't have to see me like downloading NPM modules and setting up application stuff like that. But this is what I've done so far to get this application up and running. I've created a new React app using Vite, and I used Vite because it's quick and it's simple. Versus something like Create React App or something like that, it's going to give me a lot more stuff than what I need. And so if you're not familiar with Vite, it's just another framework that you can use to create React apps and server development servers and all that kind of fun stuff. I am using TypeScript with this because TypeScript. But the TypeScript, if you're not familiar with it, it's very minimal. If you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand and ask, and I'll explain what's going on here, but it's pretty minimal. After I created the Vite app, I installed Cypress into the application as well. And to install Cypress is just a simple npm command. You don't have to worry about setting up a whole bunch of additional software or anything like that. You just install Cypress and then get it up and running. And let me get rid of these Slack controls because it's taking up like half my screen, or zoom on that. Throw it down. Let's close all this stuff. Okay, so here is the application. So it's pretty basic right now. The default Vite gives you a main component for your app and then an app component. I'm going to go ahead and start up Cypress. And to do that, we'll run the Cypress open command. Let's see if I can make that font a little bit bigger. That's the whole thing. Okay, and so Cypress is an application that runs in desktop mode most of the time when you're interacting with it. This gives you an interface that will help you get it set up. And so you can see right here, we kind of have a choose your own adventure and what type of testing that you want to do. You can either do end-to-end testing or component testing. That's not necessarily true. You can also do other types of testing. You do API testing, you do unit testing, but first-class support is end-to-end testing, component testing. You can see that right now, neither one of them is configured. Nice thing about Cypress is that it will take you through the configuration just by going through this wizard here. You can see that it's automatically detected that this application is a React app and it's using Vite. That's important because it's going to set up the application, and when we serve your components, we're actually going to use the same development server that you use when you're developing your components and whatnot. So Vite in this case, if you're using like Create React app, we use like Webpack. Also, just real quick, this is the React group, but if you happen to work with other frameworks as well, like we do component testing for Angular and Svelte and Vue officially. But then we have community libraries that plug in some of the other ones like Solid, and we got one working for Quick, and pretty much I think within the next 6 months that we're going to have like pretty much every major framework supported in Cypress. This is just doing a quick dependency check, make sure that you have all the dependencies that you need. I've never seen the screen come back and say like, hey, you need to install something additional. I'm not too sure why we even still have it, but we'll click continue. And then this screen right here is basically telling you about all the files that we're going to add to your project and give you a little bit of a description. So we got the Cypress configuration file, and then we have some standard support files that we'll get into a little bit later, and picture file and whatnot. I'll explain all that as we start playing around with them. And boom, that was it. Now Cypress is actually up and running and configured inside of this project. The browsers that we support out of the box are Chrome, Edge, and Firefox. We have experimental support now for Safari. You have to enable that through a flag. I didn't have that flag here, so you're not seeing it pop up. But I'll go ahead and select Chrome and say start component testing. Oh, I think I have, oh no, there it goes. Just run slow.
Are those like the latest versions of the browser that it's testing?
So those are the browsers that are currently installed on my machine. So Firefox is probably old because I boot that up like once every 6 months, but Chrome should be like up to date. And the version, you also saw Electron in that list as well. The version of Chromium that it uses is what's actually shipped with Cypress. And so that'll be like whatever's current with the.
So there are driver dependencies.
What's that?
Driver dependencies that are installed as well.
Driver dependencies for the browsers.
Yes.
That it's all dependent on, like, if you have the browser on your phone that's going to use it, you don't need to install any additional drivers or anything like that. Okay, so here, this is the Cypress test runner. This is where you're going to see a list of all your specs that you can run. You can see right now that we don't currently have any specs, but before we create any specs, let's create a component to start testing. And so one of the things that we're going to do for our login form is we're going to have a main login form component. And so I'll go ahead and create, kind of start stubbing that out. Oh, that period is folder. Hold on. File. I'll just use a snippet right here to create a component for me, and we'll call this a login form. And so you can see I got a little bit of TypeScript right here defining the interface for the props that's going to be passed into it. But right now I just have a login form, and I'll just type in test right now for it. And I'll go back over to the test runner, and we can actually create a spec from a component file. So I'll say create from component. This is going to list up and show all the components that are currently in the application. And I'll select the login form. And then it generates my first spec for me. And then runs it. So you can see over here on the right-hand side, this is the application under test area. So this is showing us our component mounted in. Let's go look at the file that it created for us. So by default, all of our spec files are like component.sci.extension. And we use sci, a little bit of a branding play there, but also so that it doesn't like interfere with any other tests that you're probably having an application now, like if you're using React test library or something like that, and you're converting over. So here's our spec. And so go over this a little bit real quick. The first thing we have here is the describe block. And this is setting up the context of what the spec is going to test. The first parameter in here is kind of like the description of what the spec does. And so we pass in login form and like using the React component syntax to show that this is going to be a login form that's being tested. And then we have these if blocks, and these if blocks are the actual tests themselves. And so you usually want to put something descriptive of what the test is going to be doing in here. For this basic test, we're just saying like, hey, we're just rendering the component. To render the component, use the sci.mount command. This is where I said is the biggest difference between end-to-end tests and component tests. End-to-end tests use sci.visit to visit a URL. Component tests use sci.mount to mount a particular component. And then to mount the component, you just pass in a little bit of JSX there to mount it. So you can see we got our login form. Now, our designers were pretty nice. They set up already all the HTML and CSS that we're going to use to build out our login form. So I'll come over here and just grab the snippet of HTML that they have for us. And inside of the login form, I'll replace this div tag with it and come through and update all these classes to class name because React. This lag is throwing me off my game. All right, so I'll go ahead and save that, go back over to the test runner, and you can see we have our login form. Thank you. That was the presentation. No, just kidding. They sent us some CSS as well. And so I'll come over here and grab the CSS. And I'm just going to replace everything that's in the app CSS with this. And if we go back over to the test, we'll see that we're still not getting the CSS. And that is because this app CSS file is actually being imported in the app component. And I'm not mounting the app component, I'm mounting a component that would eventually be a child of this app component. But all this CSS is global CSS. And so I'm going to set it up in the same way that we kind of do inside of our application that's being imported at a global level. We have a place for you to import these type of assets over here in the Cypress folder. So if we go to Cypress support down here to component, this is kind of like where we can set up a bunch of different things for component tests. And one of the things that we can do in here is import global assets. So path to file.
So this is an unfortunate necessity for component testing, right?
Yeah. Basically, like whatever you do to set up your main application, to display like anything that you have to import, like the main component files or the index file or anything like that, you also have to do for component testing as well. So now we got our styles into the component, but they're using a custom font as well. Now, if you're like me, I don't normally notice like differences in fonts and colors and blurry images and stuff like that, as my design team likes to tell me every time I take a screenshot of something. But if we come over here to the computed tab, I can scroll down here. And if my Zoom stuff wasn't in the way. Let's inspect it. We can see that right now it's just using Helvetica, one of the default fonts set up to use. Now, this is one of the things I really like about Cypress component testing versus some of the other component testing alternatives that are out there, is that Cypress actually loads your component inside of a real browser. And so you have access to all the same developer tools, like the Chrome Dev tools here. And so I can come in here, I can inspect, I can actually debug my code, set breakpoints and walk through it, and both the test and the actual component code as well. Play around with CSS, all that kind of fun stuff. But let's go, they sent us the link tags to use for the fonts. And so I'll copy these. And so this is the component index file. This is another place that you can import assets or set up your file and whatnot. This is what your component gets mounted into freshly on each test. Paste. No.
Is that a separate file for every component that you're testing?
No, this is one that's shared for all the tests in the suite. Yep. All right, and so you might have noticed that the font changed there, and if I inspect in here, you can see now that we're using the custom Google font for this web. All right, so we got our login form, but we want to break this down into smaller pieces, start componentizing, if you will, this whole application. And looking at what we have right here, I could break it out. We got a couple of fields that have to do with the input field. We got a label, we got the field, and then we also have an error message that's not showing right now for this. And so we can break those items down into like an input field component. But maybe we can start small, like just this login component, and see what that looks like. This is another thing that I really like about Cypress component testing, is it's kind of an aid that I use when I'm building components. I'll go through, start modifying a little bit, see that run in the browser and whatnot. If you notice, like I never had to start up the Vite dev server and like go and like throw this up on a page just to see it render or something like that. I can do everything inside a component test. All right, so we will create a button component. button. Now I'm going to come over here to the login form and actually just take this HTML straight out of here and paste it into here. Give me 1 second here because I have this snippets thing, and if this isn't working, you don't want to see me type a whole bunch of it. There we go. So, okay, if we go back over to the test runner and come back over here, this right here is how you get back to your specs. We need to create a new spec for the button. So I'll use the tool here to do it again. And see the button render. All right, now let's think about the couple of use cases that we have for the button. One of the things that we do is right now we have some hard-coded text for the button, as it says login right now. So that's one thing that we'll want to be customizable. And the other thing that I can think of is that we'll want to make sure that the button properly responds to like on-click events. So let's throw in our first test here. And we'll kind of do this like in a TDD style. We'll write the test, we'll see it fail, we'll go and modify the component and see it pass. And so our first test here says it's going to use custom text for the button label. So I'll write a mount command. And we'll just say click me. So that's going to mount the component with custom text that we're passing into it. Now what we want to do, if we think about how we write a test, we kind of do arrange, was it? My brain, arrange, act, and assert. And so we kind of arranged it so far. We're setting up everything for the test. Now we want to kind of do an action on it. And so to do the action, what we're going to do is we're going to use a selector to select that button. And the main way that you do a selector with Cypress is using the sci.get command. And the sci.get command, it mainly takes a string, and with the string, you can pass in CSS type selectors into it. And so I'm just going to use button. Now, I typically don't recommend, it's kind of against our best practices to select by an element name, just because you never know, like if somebody's going to throw another button on the screen, but this is the button component. I can feel fairly confident that there's only going to be one button in the button component. And so we're going to get the button, and then now we're going to write an assertion. And so we're going to say it should contain the text. We'll go back over to the test runner. Now this is not currently going to pass because we haven't done anything to the component for it to use that custom text yet. And so over here on the left-hand side, wish I had a zoom tool, is what we call the command log. And this is showing you everything that's happening for every command and action and stuff that you write. It's going to show up here in this log and tell you what's going on. So you can see here we're mounting the component. We're getting the button. You can see the button is kind of highlighted right now. It's showing you that it found and what it found inside of the area under test. And then we got an error here. We said, hey, we expected this button to contain click me, but the text that it came back with was login. So over here, so we passed in this text as children to the button component. So we'll come over here and add it as a prop. Use it. And so right here, this is a TypeScript thing. You see there's some red squigglies underneath the children right now telling us like, hey, this isn't a valid prop. And that's because I don't have anything in my interface for button props right now. So I'm actually going to extend this using the React button component. Extend this. And so this here will let me pass in any prop into my custom component that you can normally pass into a button component, including children. So that. And now we'll come back and you can see the test already ran because I saved it when I tabbed it back, but the test already ran and now it passes. And you can see over here that this is the click me. I can also go back into other tests, and with the other tests, I can see what the rendered output was for pretty much every step inside of the command log. I can hover over it and see it. And you can see right here that the button, if I click on it, it'll stay. The button doesn't have any text in the render one right now. So I'll come up here, and just pass in some custom text here as well. Now you can see the button there says hello for that test. These are the types of things that if you're using Cypress Cloud, you can go back through and view histories of it all. All right, so the next test that we want to write here is that the button is going to respond to click events. So that when a button is clicked on click, not click X, should be called. So the way that we're going to do this is we're going to pass in an on-click handler, right? And here we're going to pass in something. What we can pass in here is a spy. And so if you're not familiar with spies, a spy is a special function that's provided by a testing library like Cypress that you can use to pass in as a fake version of another function that you would normally do. And a spy will keep track of things like how many times it was called, what parameters it was called with. And so you can inspect it later afterwards to be like, hey, were you ever called? And that's exactly what we'll do here. So we'll use the spy, or we'll create a value and we'll call it on click spy. And we'll use spy.spy to create it. And then I'm going to use this as syntax here to save it to an alias. And this alias will let me access it a little bit later on using Cypress syntax. Okay, so let's get that button like we did previously. And now we're going to do an action. And so you can do actions inside of your components just like a real user would. So you can do clicks, you can do double clicks, right clicks, you can, if there's a select option, you can select different options and whatnot. But basically any type of navigation interaction with the website that a user would normally do, you can do via code as well. So we'll just call click. So set that button click. And now we want to verify that that spy was actually called. And so to do so, I'll use sci.get, and this is where I'm going to get the alias that I set up right here. And to access an alias, we use the that symbol before it. And so now I have, this is going to return back the spy. And I'll say, hey, it should have been called. Here somewhere up in here. Oh, should we pass in that spy to the on-click handler? Now we can see it trying to work. Go back and look. So we can see see the button. You can see that we clicked it. You'll see the little red dot that's showing you like where it clicked the actual element. But the test didn't pass. Anybody guess why the test didn't pass? Nah, that's all right. I've done this before. Test didn't pass is because even though we're accepting all these props that the button that a regular button could take, we're not passing those to our actual inner component, the actual button HTML element. And so to do so, we'll just spread those additional props over the button element. So we'll use the spread operators here, the rest of the spread operators. Email response. There we go. So any additional property that we pass into our component is now going to end up on this button element, including the on-click handler that we have set up on the test. They all pass. All right, so that's good for our button component. Let's move on to the input field component now. Any questions right now? All right, so I'll create a new file for input field. And come over to the login form. And I'm going to delete this one. Copy this text. Okay, so we have a few hard-coded things here in here that we're going to want to switch out for dynamic values. Got the label for it, and then you have the name and the required message. And so a few of these are custom to our component, namely the label. And so we'll set these up here in the TypeScript interface. This is making it so that we can pass these values into the component as props. It's going to be a string, and the required message is going to be a string. We'll get these in as props. And then we'll spread the rest of the props like we did before. And we'll update these. So this will be the label. We'll use the name, which is actually oh, I need to extend this interface up here. So name is a value that you can pass into any HTML attribute. So if I extend this with one, I'll be able to use name. Set it up as an input element. So props.name. Just copy this. So, then we replace this with required message. There we go. Over here, and you have a question? Sorry. Come over here and create. Spec for it. And you can see right now there's nothing here because we're not passing in any props to it right now.
A question on the creation of those. Can that be, is there a setting to do that automatically as soon as it detects there's a new one?
The creation of the spec. Not for React. There is, if you happen to be, well, hold on, let me think about this. If you happen to use NX, if you're familiar with NX, it's a monorepo technology. They're really integrated into Cypress as well, and they provide a lot of additional tooling on top of it. They actually have something that will go through and create a spec for each of your components in a particular application. Part that I'm not too sure, I know for sure it works for Angular. The part I'm not quite too sure if it also works for the other frameworks that they support as well, like React. But there's nothing in Cypress that does that.
A little bit of custom coding.
Yeah, I was just thinking you could script it.
Yeah.
It's definitely something you can do. It's just forget the name of the tool, but NX uses it as a way to generate scaffold. So you call one command to spawn others.
Okay. So let's set up label, username, the required message. We'll say username is required. And then we'll give the name of lowercase username. Format. There we go. Is there another question that popped up over here?
Oh, I was just gonna say, like, when you update your component, will that command automatically add the example test for the thing that you add?
No, it only, so the question was, will the component like continue to update like as we go along? No, it only does it like that one time when we create it. It kind of just scaffolds out this little test for us.
It just scaffolds out the mount, right? Doesn't do anything else.
Right. Okay, now with that in here, we got username and input field for us. Let's go back and take a look at the input field real quick. So you can see here, I have this required message, and I'm using some ARIA labels to help drive the logic if this required message is going to show up or not. So we got this ARIA invalid, and right now it's hard coded to false, but we're going here in a few minutes, we're going to make this dynamic so that when the field isn't valid, that this will be true. And our CSS here is basically set up to say like, hey, when this is true, this is going to display based on the CSS class and whatnot. I'm not going to dive into that because it's kind of a little gnarly, but that's what's happening here. So just to show you, if you remember, like the error message isn't showing right now, I set this to true. Now we do see it. All right, our first test that we're going to do here. We'll say, hey, we should show an error if the field is blank and the form has been submitted. I don't like to yell at the users that like, hey, everything is required before they actually go and like fill out the form. One of the things I like to do is wait until they don't do everything that's required and they hit submit. That's when I like to show them the messages. Oh, I have a typo in my prop name here. Let me fix that real quick. Wired message. That's why I like TypeScript. All right, so it should show an error if field is blank and the form has been submitted. So in order to do this, we need to modify the field a little bit, but before we do that, let's go ahead and finish out writing the test. So we're mounting the component. Now we want to make sure that the error is showing. And going back and looking at this real quick, there's a few different ways that we could select this error message. We could select it by span, as it's the only span in here. We could select it by its ID with whatever the name that we pass into it. We can select it by the class. But those are all what I would consider like brittle selectors. At any particular point in time, like a developer could go in and change like one of these, like especially like if we're doing some type of CSS and JavaScript framework, this error message is probably going to be replaced by like, something like that or whatnot. So we normally don't recommend that you write your selectors based on that. I'm a big fan of the way that React testing library does it with their actions. So they got stuff like get by role and get by label and all these other things. And one of the cool things that you get when you're kind of using that type of philosophy is it helps you make sure that the components that you're building are accessible to like screen readers and whatnot. And so if you kind of like buy into that and write your selectors that way, you're kind of helping making your website more accessible at the same time. And to go on that, there is actually a Cypress testing library package as well that you can install that will give you all the same methods that you would get with like React testing library. I'm not using that here, but one of the ones that I kind of wish React testing or testing library had was something like get by or get error. I don't remember what I would call it, like get error message by. And here, what we could do is just pass in the name of the label to search for. And then this could kind of go through, find the element. Because what we're doing here is we're actually selecting stuff off of the screen, kind of like how a real user would try to find it. If they're looking for the username input field, they're going to look for the input field that has the label username next to it. We're kind of doing the same here. We're trying to find the error message that has the username label attached with it. So we can do this because with Cypress, you can actually create your own custom commands like this message. And let's go ahead and do that. So come up here to commands. This is where all this fun stuff happens. And I already wrote this. And this isn't something I'm necessarily going to recommend that you go out and do for each one. I would recommend that you use something like testing library. But testing library doesn't have this one. And I'm also not recommending that, I'll have a link to this repo at the end. I'm also not recommending that you go and use this because I just wrote this morning. I don't know like how well it works. It works for this demo. But yeah, I got a kind of a few things in here. Finding the label, and then basically once I find the label, I'm looking for that error message span, the ARIA attributes and stuff that go along with it to try to locate that error message span. So we'll define this custom function, and then to make it available to all of your tests, you add it as a command. So we'll say cypress.commands.add this. And then we get the function. And up here, if you're using TypeScript, you want to make sure that you update the types. And this kind of shows you how to do it. Get rid of all these examples. Say type of function. So in my actual test, I should be able to say sci.get error message for. So we'll get the error message for a username. And now we want to run an assertion. So we're saying should show error. So we want to say should be .visible, meaning that it's in the DOM. And because we're using a rope browser, we can tell if the element is actually displaying or not, that it's not hidden by any type of CSS or anything like that. Back to the test runner and
Not actually doing that button click though, just to render the error, right?
Yeah, I'm a little confused because the test didn't show up in here. Okay, so there's no actual button in the input field component. So the input field component is actually going to take a submitted prop, and its parent component will tell it if the form has been submitted or not. That's not why it's not showing it in here. I might have to start Cypress here. But let's go and update the input field to take in that submitted. And so instead of hard coding this value right here, we'll actually make this dynamic. And so we'll want to say the field is invalid if the form is submitted and it doesn't have a value. So that, what's going on with the test here?
Error on your code.
Yeah, because I just added the submitted, which is required. But I did, so I added that other test inside of this bit. So it isn't showing up. So here to go over real quick. Okay, so show the field is blank and the form has been submitted. So we'll set submitted to true. Here we go. The next few tests the stuff that we've seen. So should not show error if there is no value and the form has not been submitted. And so make sure that the value is blank, that the form has not been submitted. We're using our custom command again, and then we're saying, hey, it should not be visible this time. Yep. Should not show an error if there is a value and the form has been submitted. So we're giving it a value, and we're sending submitted to true. Run so fast you can't even see. This last one, when input is modified, onChange should be called. So we saw previously how we could listen to an on-click event through a button. This is pretty much the same deal. We're going to use a Cypress spy to spy on the on-click or on-change method. And so I already have this set up. This value, put that value in there. But what we're doing in here that's new is we're using a different action on an input element. And I have this, let's make sure it's in the wrong area. I have this get error message for, but I'm going to create another one that's going to be get input for. It's going to kind of do the same deal. So get input for the username. So we're back over to the commands file. Kind of doing the same thing, but instead of looking for that error message span, it's now looking for an input that is tied to the label. Add the custom command.
Why are these not already built into the library?
I just envisioned these myself this morning as I was actually doing this. I'm like, I kind of wanted to do this demo using the testing library, but I was like, if I did that, I would have to install another npm package. I'd have to go and set it up, and I'd have to try to explain it all in front of a crowd. I was like, what would it be like if I just created one that kind of did the same thing and also at the same time I could show off a custom Cypress command? So that's why I said I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you go and do this. I would recommend that you try to find something that already exists. Cypress had, I didn't mention this before, but Cypress has a pretty vast plugin ecosystem. Testing library being one of our most popular packages. I think probably about a third of our users actually use the testing library package. So I think another good question is, why don't we, since so many of our users are using the testing library package, why is that just not built in? And that is something that we're actually evaluating right now. Add the type. So here, now this is going to return back the input element. And with the input element, we can use a type action, and this will type in text. So we'll type in ABC123 into the actual field. And what we want to do here is now ask that spy that we passed into it, like, hey, were you called, was the onChange event called with this particular value? I'm going to paste this in here because this code's a little bit gnarly. So we're saying, hey, we're getting the spy, and then we're saying should. If we remember in the button example, we said, hey, should have been called. When you do the text comparison like that, using the text operator, it's a shallow comparison on the object, not a deep comparison. And since this is passing in an object that has child properties and whatnot, like we can't use that. We have to actually dive deep into the object to make sure that the values exist. So that's what we're doing here. And so an option for should is you can pass in your own function to do the check. And that's what we're doing. And then we're just using an expect call. We're saying, hey, we are expecting the arguments that got passed into our function, the value of it equal ABC123. Okay, and anybody want to guess why this one's not working?
Changed by.
Same reason as last time. I think,
Asking the props.
yeah, I don't recall if I spread the props on the input field, and I did not. Oh, one other thing, I want to also take this type off. Let's see. Oh, it's always good to spread the props at the end, just in case. Want to overwrite any of those ones. All right, now let's see if it works. There we go. Cool. Let's pull back up the login form and then add our input fields back into it. Use VS Code to import that component for me. There we go. So now we got one for username, one for password, making sure that we're setting the type of password to password so that it shows dots instead of the real password. Right now we're hard coding the submitted value. We'll update that here in a second. Now we got our login form kind of back. We also need to add the button. There we go. Okay, so with our button, so now we started small. We created components very at the micro level. Now we're starting to add those components into another component. And that's kind of how you do it with a component-driven architecture. You kind of start building up until you get to components that are like whole pages, right? So now we'll write a component test that is testing the login form itself and some of the functionality that it's going to have. One of the first things that we're going to want to check is we made sure that those validation messages showed up on the input field, but now we're going to have some logic driven by our login form that makes those show up. And so we'll write a test for that. So here we got field should show validation messages if they are blank and the form is submitted. So we're mounting the login form. We're clicking the login button. So this is going to make sure that the form is submitted. And then we're making sure that the username and password error messages are visible. Now, currently, this isn't going to work because we haven't put, oh, I got one thing going on in here. The form is submitting on itself over and over again. And that is because I'm not preventing the default behavior of the form. So I'll add in this handle submit method that prevents default on it. It's not submit. Submit. All right, there we go. And so our error messages aren't showing up. Let's go and add the logic to get that to work. To do that, we're going to actually need to add some things inside of the components. The first thing that we're going to need is a value that's going to keep track of if the form has been submitted or not. And so we'll use the useState hook to store some local state here inside of our component. So let's see, we'll call it submitted, and then we'll have the method to set it. State, and we'll set the default value to false. And then when the form is submitted, we will set the value to true. So we'll replace these hard-coded values with submitted. Now our validation messages are showing. Next thing, we should not show the validation messages if the inputs have values and the form is submitted. So we're getting the inputs, we're typing in some values into the inputs, we're clicking the login button, and then we're going to make sure that the values aren't visible. Now, what we need to do to get this is that since now we're typing into the form fields, we need to store the state of the actual form fields somewhere, and we're going to do that inside of the login form component. So we'll create a couple more values up here. We'll have one for username. And we'll set the default value to a blank string. And we'll do one for password. And down here on the input field, set the value to the appropriate value. And then on the on change event, the one that we actually already tested, so we know it works. So hey, when it changes, we'll set the username to be the target value. Copy this. Password.
It's kind of a curious test because when you click login, you're actually like going to redirect somewhere else, right? So you wouldn't expect you need to test for those values.
We'll get to that. So right now I don't have any logic in here to handle what happens when a successful login actually happens, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Okay, so that is working as expected, and I think that actually might be the next test that we want to do here. So here we're going to test an invalid login first. And so when an invalid username and password shows, we want to make sure that, or when the credentials are invalid, we want to make sure we show a bad username or password error message. Now, in order to do something usually like authentication, you usually need like a backend server or something like that to tie into. Well, fortunately, I already got the API endpoints and stuff of all this, of the things that our backend developers did for authentication. So we can go ahead and build out that part of the form. Now it's not up and running yet, but we'll get around that. So here is the login function that they sent over to me. And so we're going to make a fetch request to the auth endpoint, and we're going to pass it and the username and password. And right now we know if it returns back a status code of 4 or 1 that our authentication request was invalid. And when we do that, we're going to set an error message to bad username or password. Let's come up here and create that state value real quick. And so here in the submit, we'll first make sure that we actually have values for username and password. And if we do, we'll call the login function, pass those in. Down here, instead of like showing, comment that one out. And we'll show this one, hey, if we have an error message, we'll go ahead and display this tag, and instead of the hard-coded message, we'll use the error message. Let's see this run real quick. So we'll go through here, see what's going on, and you can see like, oopsie doopsie, we actually tried to make a HTTP request to this endpoint, which doesn't exist because this is just the local dev server that's running. But fortunately, Cypress actually provides a mechanism to mock out API requests at the network level. So we can set up something that will intercept this request, and we can do several things with it. We can treat it like a normal spy, be like, hey, was this network request actually called? and just have it pass on through like normal. We could await on it. So like if we're doing something that's a long running request, we can await on it to make sure that the request actually finishes before we continue all of our testing. Or we can provide a mock value that to return from it. So in this particular case, we'll return back a mock value since we're not talking to a rollback server. So to do that, I'll come up here to the top of the test, and this method is called sci.intercept. And let's see, I think the first value is the method that is being called, and then the URL. And then the third parameter is the mock that we want to return back. And we saw in the test that we were actually looking for a 401 status code. And so we'll just return back a request that has a 401 status code. We see it passing. Come look here. This recently changed in the UI, but basically when it's a blank red circle like this, that means that it was intercepted by one of our things. I'm not too sure what the design decision was on that, but that's what if you noticed earlier, it was a full red circle. Now it's a blank red circle. But yeah, it's intercepted our auth request, returned back our stubbed response, and our test now pass. So now let's basically do the same thing, but for a valid login. Oh, my snippet's not there. Gotta watch my code. No, I'll just take this. And so should show welcome message. Credentials are valid. And the only thing different that we're going to do here is we're going to return back a 200 response code instead. That's going to signify that the login was successful for our simple login form. Let's see what I need to do. I'm bad user. Good user. And we want to make sure that a message displays saying welcome. As well. Let's go update the form. So in order to tell if we're logged in or not, we're going to have a value. It's going to be a Boolean value called BizAuth. And in here, the response code is a 200. Size 2 what? We'll set is off to true. And down here, is off to true. We will show the welcome message. Now this is a little contrived. Usually you just wouldn't show a welcome message. Usually you'll do a redirect or something like that, but you do that in your code. Welcome. Oh, I did something you didn't like. There's some stuff to my
You have default on BizAuth.
Oh, I messed up the code. this now instead of 11 for them. So that is set of false, false. True. Oh, well, pretend it worked. I think like you probably see like where it was heading or whatnot. And
Can you take one step back? Can you uncomment that last test that isn't working? And go back to the test runner UI. When you were talking about that open red circle on the 401 response. Results on that. Is it breaking now without that too?
yeah, I mean, go back into the just undo some things, get it back to that state. Something before that. This test passed though. Oh well. Fortunately, that was the that was the last sample, so it's not like we're dead in the water. Cool. So let's kind of circle back real quick and talk about some of the stuff that we showed. So I showed how to install Cypress into an application here on this slide. I didn't actually show it, but I told you I did it. And then we set up Cypress component testing inside the application, and then went through how to do basic component testing. So doing things like mounting a component and running selectors on it, doing actions and commands and all that kind of stuff, how to use like spies and mocks to look at the components, how to use the browser dev tools to go through and inspect items and use the developer tools and stuff that you already know and love. And yeah, all that kind of fun stuff. So with that, I will open it up. This is a link to the repo where there's actually a working version of it that you can go. It's in the working directory. And then for like pretty much anything that you want to learn about Cypress, the docs are the best location. So docs.cypress.io. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Eli Lucas, mainly on Twitter, but you can find me on GitHub and Discord and stuff at all the same things. Definitely React and Discord as well. Cool. Any questions?
Sure. Got a bunch of, can you do an end-to-end test demo? Just kidding. Okay, so we I don't know that we use component testing, but we're definitely using end tests. Can you just briefly describe, the bells and whistles?
Bells and whistles of end-to-end testing?
Yeah.
Yeah, so end-to-end testing is kind of, like I said earlier, it's what we're mainly known for. A lot of the experience of doing it is kind of what we already saw. You get the same Cypress API that we're using here, you also get with end-to-end testing. That's what kind of makes it nice if you want to do both end-to-end and component testing. You're not having to learn another set of tools like if you were to do your end-to-end test in Cypress and your component test and like the testing library, something like that. Completely different API, completely different philosophy and setups and tools and whatnot. This is just kind of one install into your application and it runs both. But yeah, so kind of some of the additional bells and whistles that you get. I'm sure there are. I'm kind of like drawing a blank on like what they would primarily be. But yeah, the major thing with end-to-end testing is it's doing a complete end-to-end test of your application for the most part. You can go through and mock out APIs and stuff like we did in our component test. You can also do those in end-to-end testing. But those are to kind of make sure that your application is up and running. It kind of gives you the utmost confidence that your application is working the way that it's supposed to be working. However, end-to-end tests they're harder to write. They're a lot slower. You can have flakiness in them. Just because there's so many moving parts with all the different, like if you have to set up an entire backend to run them, to make sure that the database is up and running, that the backend servers are up and running, and all that kind of fun stuff. What I mean by flakiness is that sometimes the test will pass and sometimes it won't. That is something that we can actually automatically detect with Cypress Cloud, and then show you like what tests are flaky so that you could be alerted to them and your attention can be drawn to them.
Then is it a matter of just going back and rewriting the tests?
Yeah, and so what you actually do is with Cypress Cloud, you set up a test retries. And so if a test fails, you can automatically retry it. And that's how we do it. So you're not like if it failed the first time, but passed the second, third, or fourth time, or however many you set the retries for. If it goes through that scenario, that's how we flag it as flaky.
Curious, do you all drink your own champagne by testing the desktop app?
Yep. And so we actually test Cypress with Cypress. And it was actually a pretty strong feat considering that Cypress is mostly an Electron app. All the stuff that I showed you initially was the desktop running inside of Electron. And that is something that we normally don't do. But if you wanted to do that, you can go see it, like how we did it. But yeah, so we test Cypress with Cypress, and then all of our other, like our cloud service and whatnot. It's like, yeah, we're all over it.
Also curious, how does this stuff scale? Like let's say a really big project in like CI/CD pipelines.
Yep. So that's something, if you have a really big project, that's where something like the cloud becomes really beneficial, because with that, we have a smart orchestration feature, which can orchestrate your tests in your CI/CD pipelines. And so it can parallelize it to different tests. So we'll basically be like, okay, all your test runners spin up. I'm going to tell you to do these tests, you to do these tests, you to do these tests. We can kind of do a smart prioritization of the test, be like, hey, in your last run, this test failed. Let's make sure we run that first, so you're not wasting a whole nother run waiting for test 999 out of 1,000 to fail. You can do auto cancellation so that if one does fail, like it kicks out the entire suite as well. And then you can also do like test groupings. And so if you only want to run certain tests, like let's say you have a difference between a full test suite before you actually ship the product versus like a smoke test versus like a nightly test or test for individual PRs and whatnot, like the cloud will help put all that together. Yeah.
Let's say you don't have the cloud and you want to like get all the benefit within an existing CI. How would that work?
Yeah, so cloud doesn't replace your existing CI, it works along with it. So like Circle, GitHub, Jenkins, like pretty much any of the CIs out there. But if you didn't want to, there's usually like community-based plugins that do a lot of the, well, some of the things, same things. One of the biggest ones is that the ability to parallelize your tests exists through community plugins. To get the smart orchestration features and stuff like that, usually you need some type of backend that keeps track of all that data to do it. I'm not aware of like any community plugins. There's also competitors that we have to the cloud product out there that actually tie into Cypress as well. And so like, I'm going to tell you who they are, but you can probably find them. No questions? Yeah, let's.
So right now we're looking at like, we just happen to have 0 unit tests in the front end. So I've been looking at Cypress versus Jest. So you mentioned unit tests earlier.
Mhm.
How would you compare the two? I know you're a little biased,
Yeah.
but like how would unit tests work in Cypress?
I mean, so Cypress, you saw the 2 first class tests, Indian tests and component tests that we have in the park. You can do unit tests with it. The thing is that when you're viewing them in the test runner, like you don't get basically that right-hand side where you saw the web application. You just don't get anything over there for unit tests because there's no real output to a unit test. You can still use it. You can write the describe blocks and then use like expect, like you won't be doing things like grabbing stuff from the DOM or anything like that. You're just writing unit tests against like functions and whatnot. And so you can, Cypress is packaged with Mocha and sign on to like really popular testing libraries. And so you can just use those APIs directly, or if Jest, you're using like the Jest API. So you could do it kind of I would say I'm a little up in the air on that. Like in one aspect, it's really nice to have everything just under one suite. But the Jest test runner itself for unit tests is a lot better than our test runner because it has like a nice watch mode that will look at your Git commit history and like only like run tests for files that have like changes on it currently and stuff like that. And we got stuff like that in the backlog, but it's not currently there. So like for unit testing, like Jest still probably has a hands up on Cypress. But if you wanted everything under like one suite, I think that's a pretty big value add on as well.
My company uses both.
Yeah.
They use Cypress for component level and end-to-end testing, and they use Jest for unit tests.
The big thing is Jest is headless, right? So there is no window.
Yeah.
to work from. So unit tests work really well in Jest because it's just function assertions. Cypress is headed. It's a browser. So you can do DOM stuff there. You can do DOM stuff in Jest, but you have to then use JS DOM and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I would say that's probably another advantage. Jeff kind of alluded to it, but when you're running Jest tests, those are actually running inside a node. And if you're doing component tests, those are running inside of JS DOM, which is like a virtualized environment, not a real browser. If you're doing unit tests with Cypress, those are actually running inside of a real browser where your code runs. And so if there's any like just oddities between like Node and the V8 or the whatever engine that you're running your tests in the browser, that might pop up. But in my experience, I've never actually run into that.
I do. Yeah, sorry. So let's say you did have like a full-fledged application and there was no Cypress. So if you were to like start from scratch, are there some things that you would recommend starting like testing?
Yeah.
Especially if a lot of things is dependent on like requests and long like file loads where it's like long and like streaming where it's been on like listening to data from boards. So like things where like the biggest heavy lifting is not necessarily like components.
Mm-hmm. So if you're starting from scratch, I would definitely recommend that you check out our best practices guide and follow that because you can really go astray pretty quickly if you're not following the best practices, especially around like test isolation, making sure that one test doesn't affect the outcomes of another test, making sure that you're using a good selector pattern, kind of the stuff I was showing, like using something like testing library to make sure your selectors are good. So that way the code updates, your tests don't break because you were trying to select something based on a weird class name or something like that. Yeah, but like really it's a component testing is a good place to start because you don't have to do a whole lot of heavy lifting to try to orchestrate a backend to go along with it. It's a little bit harder when you have to like, you have an existing project and you try to do end-to-end testing on it. As far as like your long running requests and stuff like that, like yeah, side.intercept, I'm doing it. The default wait time on everything. I didn't really talk about it, but Cypress has like waiting built into it. And so if like you try to select something from the DOM and it doesn't quite exist yet, some of the other libraries will just, no, it wasn't there, sorry. Or we have automatic waiting. We'll wait by default up to 4 seconds for it to like appear or disappear, whatever you're trying to test. And so you'd probably want to like modify those timeouts if you have like wrong running requests, like 10 seconds, 15 seconds or something like that. Or if you just mock the intercept request, like it turns back immediately.
How important is multi-browser testing for the
Everybody uses Chrome.
component level?
And so, yeah, if you know, a good majority of the engines out there right now are Chromium based between Chrome and Edge and Electron and all those kinds of things. And so like that is mainly what we see people use, especially as they're like developing. But if multi-browser is important to you in your base, I would set up your CI/CD pipeline to do one pass using one browser and another pass. Maybe you have a limited set of tests, like using another browser, and you can use like tags and stuff to like specify those types of things. But yeah, those are mainly things that I would like take care of in CI/CD versus like locally. Okay. Well, one more and then we can talk afterwards.
Earlier you had your tests were very sequential. if you wanted to have things running at the same time, like very asynchronous, can Cypress do that as well?
Yeah, that's where test parallelization comes in. It wouldn't happen like on your desktop. That's mainly something that would happen inside of like a CI/CD pipeline. I mean, I suppose if you wanted to, you could set it up to run on your desktop because you can run Cypress tests in headless mode as well, so that they're just running the command line. And so you could probably like work on, if you had a long suite that you want to make sure ran on your machine before you shipped it, you could probably do it. Mhm. Cool. All right. Awesome, guys. Thank you very much for coming. Appreciate it.
All right, thank you. My little claim to fame is the React testing library, when it was still called React testing library. I added get by role. Right. So I mean, it's not anything I wrote anymore. It's been massively changed, but I added get by role. My little, that was like 5 years ago.
We clap now.
Sure, yeah, sure. Thank you very much. Cypress is awesome. Yes, you can run multi-threaded headless. The number of workers you can use is limited by your CPU. So if you have a quad core processor, you can only run 4. And I always suggest run 3. Let your computer have some resources. I've seen people kneecap their machines very quickly going, run everything. And you're like, oh yeah, by the way, I have to still use instant messenger. All right. Work free to hang out and chat and do whatever. I do have a topic for next month of state management libraries comparisons, but I need a speaker. Like, I've got the topic. I just want someone to give it. So talk to me. Otherwise, everyone have a great night. Thank you for coming. There's a little bit of pizza left, so please eat it, or I have to take it home again. So have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.